Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and to see people who I've known in all sorts of fragments of my life, in Japan or in Cambridge or elsewhere. I thought I was going to be able to boast that I've been in Nepal longer than most of you have been alive, but there are clearly one or two of you who may have been alive when I came from Nepal, and indeed Gabriel Campbell, to my indignation, I discover must have come to Nepal only 4 years after me, so I'm not much the longest with us all, but it is rather moving in a way to be coming full cycle from a very my first arrival here in Kathmandu in December 1968. Some of you weren't born in 1968. No. You can't imagine what Kathmandu was like, or even Pokhara. Kathmandu, you could hardly buy anything, but there were one or two hotels, and there was the wonderful research center. But Pokhara, it had 5 cars, I think, because there was no road from anywhere. They had to be taken in parts. The only wheels that arrived in Pokhara were on the airplane, which then stopped under a tree, which was the Pokhara airport. There were 2 or 3 hotels which only had fried eggs, apart from rice, and there was nothing you could buy in the bazaar. It was very quiet. And so, with my first wife, I set off up to the village of Tak, which is, do most of you know the Pokhara Valley? Some of you been there? Most of you been there? Well, more or less straight north, going up into those mountains, the Annapurna Mountains. There's a big Gurung village called Siklis. I went to Nepal, of course, by mistake. All things happen by mistakes. I was meant to be going to Assam to study people near the Nagas, where I'd been born in Shillong, and my supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Hammendorf, tried to get me in, but there was a war going on. So in the end he said, why don't you go to Nepal? I can't get you into Assam. So I said, oh yes, that sounds good. Where is Nepal? I literally didn't know where it was on a map. So he got out a map and showed me where Nepal was. And I said, well, where shall I go? And he said, well, some years ago I met a very interesting young Frenchman called Bernard Pinier, and he went and worked among the Gurungs at my advice. But sadly, he's died, and his work is incomplete. So why don't you go and finish off the work that Pinier had started? So I said, yes, where shall I go? And he took out a pen and pointed at a place called Siklis. So I said, okay, I'll go to Siklis. Well, anyway, after about 2 days going on the wrong track to Siklis, the summer track, in other words, winding through the hills, I was totally exhausted, and arrived at the village, and they said, well, Siklis is another 2 days from here, why don't you stop here? So, with much relief, I stopped, and stayed and did 15 months of fieldwork with my wife Jill, my former wife Jill. I found I was a historian by training. I already had a doctorate in history, and I found it very difficult fieldwork, for reasons which I'll explain a bit later. It was very remote. You had to walk, obviously, back and forth, and there was no food. You had to eat local food. There was no privacy. There was no structure to the day. You couldn't go into the library and accumulate notes. So I found myself quite lonely, very homesick, fairly often ill, and very confused because there was no Gurung grammar or anything, so I had to learn the language from just listening to people. And so at the end of 15 months there, gathering information mainly on population and economy, I left and went back to England and wrote my PhD at School of Oriental and African Studies. And I thought I would go back. I promised to go back in 10 years' time to see them. But I thought it would just be a visit to go back and see them, and then that would be the end of it, because that's what most anthropologists do. If you look through anthropology lives of anthropologists, there are very, very few who go back. Maybe they'll go back once, maybe even twice, but that's it. Why that is, I mean, it's expensive and so on, but on the whole, continuous returns are infrequent in anthropology. Even Heimendorf went from place to place to place. He didn't go back to one place again and again. I know a very few anthropologists of the Himalayas who've been back often. Anyway, so I didn't go back in 2 years. I had young children, and then I remarried to Sarah, and we went back in 1986. And I thought, well, they'll have forgotten us. This is 16 years later. No one will remember us. We'll just go for a couple of days, and I'll show Sarah where I sit and look at the mountains, and then we'll go on to Cyprus, and that'll be that. Anyway, we arrived in the village, and everyone said, "Oh, where have you been? How are you?" And you know, broke forth into genuine affection. And many of the people I'd known 16 years before were still there. And so we stayed for, we'd only allocated a week for the visit. So we stayed there for a week, and at the end of that week, Sarah said to me, "I'm not leaving this village unless you promise to buy me a return ticket and to come back next year." Because she was absolutely loved it and was wonderful in the village. So we certainly, I said, promised to do that. When we went down into, the one person who was missing was my adopted father. As you know, in Nepal there is this system of becoming closely kindling to someone. My adopted father, Lieutenant Bowen Singh Gurung, was no longer in the village. So I went down into Pokhara, and I thought, well, he has moved into Pokhara. Maybe I'll just pop in to see him, but he may not remember me. Anyway, we were walking down the street in Pokhara, and we saw Bowen Singh and his wife. I recognized them about 200 yards away. I was walking towards them, and they turned away. I thought, well, they haven't recognized us at all. We walked a bit further, and they turned round, and there were tears pouring down their faces. Because what had happened was that his oldest son had died in the British Army at age 21. So I had been placed as his eldest son, as the person who, for instance, was one of the 4 people who had to light the funeral pyre at my mother's cremation later on in life. So we realised that we must go back. So we went back in 1987. And despite this early experience of not being very happy on my fieldwork, we went back in 1987. We went back in 1988. We went back in 1990, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 97, 99, 100, 2001, 2006, 8 and 10. So this is our 18th visit. I spent 6 years of my life in Nepal and in this village, and with the work that Sarah and I have done in England, this is at least 10 years of my life. Now, I'm actually a historian, and I write books about political philosophy and history and other subjects, so which are all exciting and interesting, but it's clear that there is something that keeps pulling me back to this place. And this is the first point I want to make about what has changed. And this is really that I have changed. Not only has my hair gone and I'm deaf and old, but inside I have changed. And the particular change that might be of interest to you is a change in my approach to what anthropology is. It's difficult for any of you to really remember, perhaps Gabriel remembers, but in the 1960s, 70s, anthropology was a science. You went out from an imperial power like England and you studied the natives. You didn't get too close to them because that would disturb the experiment. They were subjects like something inside a test tube and you were looking in and studying them. This philosophy mixed with a sort of the last residues of British imperialism and colonialism, because I am the son of many generations of colonial people in all over the world, meant that you always kept your distance. And so my first field work was really in the sort of post-Malinowski stage. Malinowski came off the veranda famously, but he never really came out of his tent very much. He was always still very close to his home, and his diaries show that he was very homesick and that he really thought of the people he was studying as inferior. So I didn't think of the people I was studying as inferior, and I had some very close friendships with some of the people who helped me. But there was a lot of reserve, and I was taught that I had to keep in this tension between participation and observation. The participation had to be kept limited, because you had to observe. Now, one of the things that has changed in me, and I've learned, is that this is all nonsense. That as we learn in life, we observe and we participate all the time. That is how we are as human beings. And you can observe perfectly well while participating. You don't have to keep away from your family or your friends to observe them. You enter into their lives. And so, particularly with the help of Sarah, who was very good at participating and wearing local costumes and so on, each time I came closer and became more involved with people. We were prepared to help people, we were prepared to get involved in the family difficulties and tragedies and so on. And I particularly became involved with a Gurung woman called Dilmaya. Dilmaya was my sister. She was Bowen Singh's brother's daughter, and he had adopted her. So she was my younger sister, about 10 years younger than me. And we came to live in her household, or in a house just in their yard. So she cooked for us, and she became the subject of my anthropology, really, the Gurung woman. And because of the closeness of brother-sister and the equality of gender relations in Gurung society, it became a very, very close relationship for about 8 years. So I allowed myself to become emotionally involved with people I was working with. And so coming to Nepal was not just anthropological fieldwork, it was coming to my family, friends, and refreshing myself psychologically from a mother world in Cambridge. The second change was that when I first went, I bought, there were one or two things in Kathmandu, and I bought a little camera, film camera, and took a little bit of film. And when I went back in 1986, I took the same camera. Then in 1988, the video revolution began, and I took a video camera for the first time. And from that time onwards, half of my work, at least, has been filming. Because, as you know, there are many things you can capture in words and writing. There are many things you can't really capture, particularly rituals and crafts. And so I have made a film archive of one Gurung village, which consists of about 130-40 hours of film, which I've made up into about 100 films so far. If any of you would like to see some of these films, then if you go to YouTube and you look, if you just type in Gurung rituals or something like that, or shamanism among the Gurungs, or honey hunting among the Gurungs, or dancing among the Gurungs, you'll probably get to my site, which is called Ayabaya, A-Y-A-B-A-Y-A, Ayabaya. That's what my grandchildren, daughters call me, Ayabaya. So it's called Ayabaya. And there is a playlist where all of my Gurung films are listed, called Virtual Village in the Himalayas. And at the moment there are about 30 films there, including one on how I do field work, which is the only film on YouTube about how anthropologists work. So if you want to see how an anthropologist works, at least in that setting, and to go with me to the village, which is what the film is about, you can have a look at that on YouTube. Anyway, the film, I think, in some ways is one of my most or more important contributions, because it's a more detailed film record of a Himalayan village, as far as I know, more detailed than most. There may be others, but I don't know of any others like it, of one place over a period of 24 years, because I just started filming when I came back, really. So that's the second change. The third is that anthropologists tend to go to one place and they do a survey or cross-section of that place at one point in time. And then they guess at how it is changing and how it will change. And that was how my first fieldwork took place. But coming back again and again and again, and Sarah doing an enormous amount of very, very detailed, intensive work on censuses, so that we mapped the village, firstly in 1968 and then 1986 with one of my students in between, Simon Strickland, and then every year. So we have every person who is born, married, died in the village, and when they go out, for 42 years. And a lot about their economic position, their fields, what rice they produce, as well as diaries and accounts. So the project turned really from a normal one-year ethnographic or anthropological study to a social history of a Himalayan village, which is again probably more detailed than you'll find, because I'm a social historian by training, and I had already done with Sarah a social history of an English village over a 500-year period. This gave me the idea that it would be interesting to do a social history of a Himalayan village over a much shorter period. So we have gathered all these very extensive records and diaries and other things, and we're putting them into a database so that one day we can deposit all this in archives in Nepal and in England. And so in 200-300 years' time, people will have the social history of one Himalayan village in its, more or less in its entirety, with many thousands of photographs and films and so on. So I became a social historian as well as an anthropologist. Now, the next change I want to talk about is about changes in theoretical frameworks. Again, it's probably difficult for most of you to appreciate the kind of theoretical framework which those of us who came out to Nepal in the 1960s and 70s had in the back of our minds. We, from Britain anyway, had a jumble of ideas which were a mixture of Marxist theories, which were very fashionable in history at that time, and were just coming into anthropology, and what was known as modernization theory, social modernization theory. Now, the framework then was very simple, and this is what I taught my students and so on. The history of mankind was divided into stages. Stage one were hunter-gatherers. Then you had tribal people. Then you had peasants. And then you had industrial modern societies. And societies moved from A to B to C to D. If you were a Marxist, then they moved from the original situation through various stages up to feudalism and then to capitalism. But none of us really doubted that that's what happened. And when we went out to various places like Nepal, we would see where the society we were in was at and then where it was going to go. So we came to Nepal, I went to the Gurus, and they were clearly just moving from being tribal people who had been up in the high hills looking after sheep, shepherds, into being settled peasants who were growing grain and rice. And so we were looking then for the next stage when they would move from being peasants into being small capitalists and then maybe settling in towns and cities and being modern people. And the other framework I had in my mind was, which I was strongly influenced by, particularly was the framework of a Cambridge economist and population expert called Thomas Malthus. Have any of you heard of Malthus? Yeah. Well, Malthus was a great prophet, and his very simple argument, and that was part of the charm of his first essay on population, was that resources grow arithmetically, like this. Population grows geometrically, exponentially like that, and there will be an inevitable clash, and then population will fall back, and then so on. And history is like this. When I came to, I'd been taught this and studied at the London School of Economics, and came really to investigate what was happening in relation to population in Nepal, and found a pure Malthusian situation. The resources in Tak were limited to forests, which were going backwards. The mountain was very steep and was drifting away, and the population was doubling very fast. Nepal was one of the fastest growing populations in Asia at that time, so there's that effect. Doubling in 25 or 30 years. So the central prediction or theme of that book was that Nepal in general and the Gurus in particular in town were facing disaster, because within 20-25 years the population would have doubled and the hillsides would have been stripped of trees. So I made these predictions which seemed watertight. Anyway, when we came back in 1986, 16 years later, I was amazed to find that it hadn't happened. The forests were still where they were. The village was no bigger than when I left it. What had happened? Well, the obvious thing that had happened is emigration. What I hadn't seen was the growth of Pokhara and the growth of overseas work in India. The population had indeed doubled, but it had split. There was half of it was still in the village. The other half was in Kathmandu, Pokhara, Bombay, Singapore, everywhere. So there was a virtual village elsewhere as well as the village there. And I hadn't foreseen this coming at all. One thing this teaches you is that the social sciences are completely incapable of predicting the future. If I told you what was going to be happening in Nepal in 2 or 3 years' time, it would be almost inevitably wrong. All we can do, that is for two simple reasons. One is that all you can do is to look at the past trends and then project them into the future. And those trends you will see are the large trends, the small individual things you won't see. And the second reason is one which is put forward by the philosopher Karl Popper, which is that all social science prediction is impossible because we do not now know what we will know in the future. Science, all sorts of things. I mean, if they suddenly discover an enormously effective way of capturing the sun's energy and replace oil with petrol and so on, it's going to have a huge effect. We don't know. No one could have predicted 5 years ago, even the last time I came to Tak, that the village of Tak would be flooded with mobile phones. And there are 3 mobile phones per household in this little village. Well, if you'd said to me 10 years ago that everyone will be just ringing out people in America and when they want to go out and do some work in the fields, they don't walk down to the bottom of the village and ask their friend down the bottom of the village, they ring them up on their mobile phone. When I wanted a shamanic rite done for me, they rang up the shaman and said, "Are you free for a ritual tomorrow?" So no one could have predicted that. Some of you, I'm sure you probably know of chaos theory, which predicts that very small changes can have enormous effects, the butterfly's wings. Now, if a butterfly's wings in California can change the climate in China, imagine what a butterfly the size of China and India, these are the butterflies on either side of Nepal, what they flap and how they do in the next 2 to 5 years will alter everything here. So it's impossible to predict. I mean, it's necessary to do so, it's fun to do so, and we're in trade of trying to help people understand what's going to happen. And sometimes we're right, but I learned, I hope, a little humility about how my predictions were likely to be completely wrong. The other thing I learned was that this whole framework of stages, moving from A to B to C, is totally unsatisfactory. It was unsatisfactory in Marxism, and modernization theory is very, very crude. We don't move from stage A to stage B to stage C. What we do is we mix things. We keep something of stage A and B while adapting and filling in with stage other things which are unexpected. And so we make new, it's like cooking. We make a new recipe out of old ingredients, and then there is something new in the world. Now, returning to the village, it definitely has changed in almost every way since I was there 42 years ago. Just to go through a few notes. In terms of the economy, that's where it's changed least, actually. It looks much the same. It's still a pre-wheel economy. You don't use wheels. You use oxen to plough. You carry on the human back. But that also has changed because there are jeeps. There's a jeepable road up to the village. So things are being carried up from the market. But within the village, it's still the same sort of economy. Though there's been a very rapid decline in livestock keeping, particularly buffaloes being kept up in the high forest or being stored in the village. The sheep no longer come down through the village as they used to with large flocks of sheep in the wood. And so the diet has changed, much less meat, milk, chubu, oil products, ghee, and much more grains. The life of those who were servicing the gurus, that is the blacksmiths, the tailors, and other folkra. This means that many of the beliefs, the witchcraft beliefs and so on, are much less strong. Though interestingly, the formal gurung shamans have been partly replaced by blacksmith-tailor shamans, Jankri, who there is a theory that they were actually the original shamans anyway, and the gurus took some of their shamanism from these people, moved it up into a gurung ritual practice. So there is in the village this mobile phone wielding shaman who does some of the gurung, the body rituals, but not nearly as elaborately. The singing and dancing, and particularly the famous gato, which is a 3-day ritual dance, which you can see on my YouTube site. Incidentally, if you can just Google my name, you'll go to my website, and there's a section on Nepal on which all those articles that were mentioned are downloadable free PDF, so you can print them off. But there's also reference to films there, and quite a lot of my films are going up also onto the university site called Digital Space, or DSpace. And there you'll find the ritual dance. So the ritual world, magical world is changing, but they still do quite a lot of family rituals there. Other things have come. There were no schools in the village when I was first there, but now there is a school, and there has been for some time. There was no electricity came last year, and there was a light bulb. There's a road, as I mentioned. There is a government office in the village. So it's turning into, in a way, a sort of suburb of Pokhara. And as this was happening, when I first noticed that they were no longer coming around in the evenings and singing and dancing, and the Gurungs were not going out and working communally, and most of my Gurung friends were going down to Pokhara and Kathmandu, I felt rather, well, very sad. This is about 1999-2000 when I wrote Sliding Downhill, which was really about how the economy is sliding downhill and the people are sliding downhill, and soon there will be no one left in the village, except perhaps the very old and the very poor. And indeed that, to a certain extent, is true. The proportion and ratios of people who are from different groups in the village has changed. Sarah kindly gave me the statistics. When I first went to Tak in the sample 1968-69, there was one Brahmin family. There are now 19 Brahmin families. There were then 2 tailor households. There are now 20 tailor households. There were 3 blacksmith households. There are now 19. There was 1 Magar household. There are now 8. There were, I don't think, any Chetri, and there are now 12 Chetri households. And instead of the 100 Gurung households which were there in that visit, there are now 40. So the proportion of Gurungs in the central area where I did my census has changed from 95% Gurung to 33% Gurung. So that is a very substantial change. But the village is still there, and it's not. If you just walk through it without investigating, it wouldn't seem very different. The buildings seem much the same, except they have tin roofs. People are doing the same sort of things. But what I discovered was that everything was sliding downhill, including the culture. And so I thought to myself, this is the end of Gurung identity and cultural distinctiveness. They no longer dance, they no longer do these communal farming and so on. The Gurungs are disappearing. They are just becoming another individuals in mass society. But in the last 10 years or so, I've begun to realize that this is still part of this modernization stage theory. That life is much more complicated than this, because spending time with my Gurung friends in Pokhara, parts of the family, Phil Meyer's family are in Pokhara, and so I spend time with them there, and I spend time with Gurung friends in England and elsewhere. And what you find is that instead of disappearing, the Gurungs have just continued on their long migration. One theory is that the Gurungs started as fishermen. And they've probably been something before, but they were fishermen. They need fish in one of their central rituals. And they were probably beside a lake in northern China or western China called Koh-i-Noor. And they fished and hunted and gathered. We're talking 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. In the great shamanic western China. And then they moved from that situation through Tibet, and they became shepherds. So they moved from hunting and gathering, fishing, to shepherding. That's 2,000 years ago. Then, 1,500 years ago, they came down through Mustang and behind out the Annapurna range, through Malang, over the top. And about 1500 years ago perhaps, or 1200 years ago, they settled in a village called Kola, which has recently been excavated. And there, for the first time, they started to grow crops. It became a permanent village. And now we're 1,000 years ago. And then they started spreading down, they went into Sikris and other big towns. And then they came down the ridges and they came down above Tak. And 250 years ago, the village was up in a higher above the village. And there they were mainly slash and burn cultivators and animal farmers. They were growing buckwheat and maize and millet. And then as the population increased, they came down and they started being recruited into the British Army, and they came down and onto the slopes, the steep slope of Tak. And this is 150, 200 years ago. And then, just around the time I was coming to Tak, they go slide or go further down, they go down into Pokhara, and now of course they all go to Britain, England, because many of them are Gurkhas. So there are more Gurungs from my village in England than there are in my village. But each time they don't stop being Gurung, because the distinctive features of their, the way they think, the way they look at things, their beliefs are carried with them. They're not abandoned. I think I've come to appreciate this deeper continuity of their lives, because for the last 10 or 12 years I've been interested in historical continuities over long periods in major civilizations where everything changes on the surface. In England, for example, I've written a lot about how the English, although they went through a scientific revolution, they went through imperialism, they went through the Industrial Revolution. The English of today are really very similar to the English of 1200 years ago. Their language, their law, their political system, their family system, their social structure, class structure and so on is very recognizable from the writings of medieval English writers up to the present. So the surface, all the surface has changed, completely different, but deep down there's a very strong continuity. And as no one knows, I also had this sudden revelation that this was the case with Japan. That Japan has gone through huge changes, Chinese invasions, Chinese philosophies, the Dutch, the later Chinese phases, the Americans, the English and so on, wave after wave, and then they had their Industrial Revolution. But underneath it all is what the greatest 20th century Japanese philosopher, Maruyama Masao, called the deep note, the basso ostinato, the deep note of the Japanese culture has not really changed for 2,000 years. So the Japanese under the surface are a shamanic civilization, straight from Siberia. Just to illustrate it with an amusing example, when I wrote this book, which I'd been working on for 15 years with a Japanese couple who were friends of mine, he was the dean of Hokkaido University and a great expert on international relations and a very important man. And he came into my room when he had read my chapter, which at last I'd understood what this was, and he looked at me in his suit and he looked at me and said, "Alan, at last I understand myself. I am a shaman." So this is in my book on Japan Through the Looking Glass. I discovered this same continuity in Japan, in England, and I discovered I'd done a lot of work on the political philosophy of Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a book about him. And Tocqueville has this view, the same view, because he'd seen the French Revolution, he'd seen that the French Revolution hadn't really changed France. He'd gone through this vast change, and it was just the same not just the same, but hadn't changed as much as people thought. And so he developed the theory of what he called the point of origin. Societies are determined by very early events in their history, and this then continues to influence them. So America was the English. I mean, America is just English. I mean, it's the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant part of America at that time that he saw was just England stripped of its caste system and its monarchy. And so if this could be the case in America, England, France, Japan, why couldn't it be the case with the Gurus, who had retained, I mean, if you go into a Gurung's home now in Kathmandu or Pokhara, and you watch how people interact with each other, how they treat each other, how they speak to each other, how they eat with their hands. We went out with a Gurung friend last night who works for UNDP, and he said, would you like a knife and fork? And I said, how are you going to eat? And he said, no, well, I will eat with my hands, of course. So you eat with your hands. And his personality, his whole way, and the way he's bringing his children up, and everything, is just what you'd see in the village. I mean, there was a school of anthropology in America in the 1930s to 60s, whose two most famous figures were Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. And in Ruth Benedict's work on patterns of culture and Margaret Mead's work on socialization, they both show how very much your early first 2 years determine your life. And if you look at the Japanese and the Gurungs have the longest child breastfeeding, more or less, in the world. They go on breastfeeding children until the next child is born. That often means that you go on breastfeeding until 4 or 5. You sleep with your baby beside you until 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You're very close physically, and you're very involved with the other person. The English push their children away at birth into a separate cot, into a separate room maybe, and the breastfeeding ends early. I mean, this is only obviously just one factor, and it's not determining of everything else, but the whole nature of personality and the social relations and the delicacy of Gurung life, which I've seen in the village, I still see in Pokhara and elsewhere. And the final way I had this idea that underneath the massive changes that are happening in Nepal and among the Gurungs, there is a deep continuity, is in my own life, because I'm now writing my autobiography. And because I never throw anything away, and have never thrown anything away since I was about 14, I have all my letters, and all my letters to myself and so on, and my mother's letters to my father are describing me and so on. So I can watch myself in detail from the age of about 4 or 5. And the person I am by the age of 9 or 10, my wife tells me, is the person I am now. I don't like losing arguments. I get angry at silly things. I'm very determined. I'm quite brave. Many of the characteristics, most of the characteristics are there when I am 11 or 12. So in our personal lives, we are continuous. We're not children and then adolescents and then grown up and then old people. We are the same person beneath. You may not believe this, but you will be the same person in 30, 40 years as you are now. You just look over on the outside. So at the personal level, at the civilizational level of England and Japan, and now I discover in the case of the Gurungs, there is much continuity, and this gives me great comfort and hope, because if I thought that the wonderful people who have drawn me back again and again to Nepal were not only disappearing from the village, but were disappearing entirely, I would be very, very sad. But I find they're still there, even if they wear suits and drive around in UN cars with labels on them or whatever it is. So thank you very much for letting me share these memories with you.